Hey guys, tonight we descend into the quietest room in America. A room so silent, it hums. Not from the walls or machines, but from the tension in your lungs as you hold your breath without realizing. You're in the observation chamber of a maximum security prison, sitting behind shatterproof glass, 30 feet from a man who's about to die. There's no dramatic countdown, no flickering light bulbs, no last-minute plot twist. Just a clipboard, a syringe, and a state official whose pulse barely flinches. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I'm always curious who's up with me at this hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You weren't supposed to be here, really. You signed up for a courthouse tour, not this unspoken add-on. But here you are, knees locked, heart rhythm synced with the ticking second hand above the chamber. The man in the room is 61, balding. His orange jumpsuit looks faded, almost pink under the sterile LEDs. The guards don't restrain him, he's not resisting. In fact, he's helping them find a vein. It's not what you expected. No screams. No last-minute confessions. Just a thin layer of glass separating you from the state's most final act. You're not watching a person die. You're watching a protocol unfold. This is lethal injection, and it's been the US's primary method of execution since the 1980s, replacing the electric chair for being, allegedly, more humane. But as you watch, you can't help wondering, humane for whom? Because there's something chilling about how ordinary it all feels. You hear someone clear their throat. A guard sneezes, and still the man is dying millimeter by millimeter under your gaze. The first drug paralyzes him. You know this. It's a neuromuscular blocker, the kind used in surgery. Only he's not getting anesthesia. That comes before. Supposedly. If the dose isn't perfect, he might still be conscious. Just unable to move. It's a detail no one here will confirm or deny. That's part of the system's genius. It's plausible deniability wrapped in lab coats and latex gloves. The second drug stops the lungs. The third, his heart. Some states used to skip the paralytic. They said it wasn't necessary. But then people started convulsing, foaming, gasping, and well, that doesn't look great on camera. So the paralytic stayed. Not for the inmate's comfort, but yours. You realize that, as the man exhales for the last time and the medic gives a discreet nod to the warden. It's over. Except it isn't. The witnesses begin filing out. A woman beside you mutters something about justice being served. Another just stares, glassy-eyed, clutching a rosary that's missing 2 beads. You follow the flow of footsteps down a fluorescent corridor, every surface too clean, like it's trying to scrub itself of guilt. And here's the kicker. This man, whose name was spoken twice tonight, once when he entered, once when he was declared dead, he was guilty. No question. He confessed, in fact. No last-ditch appeal. No doubts. He murdered 2 women in 1989. Brutally. Methodically. He even mapped it out on paper. So why do your palms feel slick with sweat now? Why does your stomach lurch? Not with grief for his victims. You mourn them deeply, but with something colder, something like complicity. Here's a fun fact, if fun can stretch that far. In 1957, the last guillotine execution in France was carried out. The same year the first episode of Leave It to Beaver aired in the US. It wasn't the Middle Ages. It was black and white TV time. Historians still argue whether that strange overlap signals how modern society clings to the illusion of progress. Ceremonial justice layered over a still-beating primal urge. You step into the parking lot, night air pressing against your skin like a wet cloth. Somewhere in the distance, a vending machine hums. The prison behind you fades into concrete silence. But the images remain, how still his hands were. How no one said his name more than once. And now, the hard question. Did what you just saw make the world safer? Did it honor the victims? Or did it just satisfy some deep-rooted desire to see harm answered by harm? Some people call that justice. Others call it symmetry. You just call it something you can't forget. Because no matter how rational the process, No matter how methodical the procedures, you've just witnessed something irreversible. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, literally. The end of a human life, sanctioned, scheduled, and socially sterilized. Strange. In this moment, you recall an old quote from Dostoevsky: "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." He never mentioned the execution chamber, but you feel like he didn't need to. You slide into your car and pause before turning the key. The silence in your head is louder than anything you heard tonight. Not even the radio feels right. You drive home with the windows cracked, letting the cold night air press against your cheeks. You don't realize you're crying until you wipe your face and the tears smear with road dust. Justice, maybe. Closure, perhaps. But peace? Not yet. You don't sleep that night. Or, more accurately, you drift, somewhere between dreams and courtroom transcripts. The execution replays itself in fragments. The tilt of the gurney, the clipboard, the oddly polite warden. At 3:12 a.m., you find yourself searching online for how many people executed in US last year. You scroll past graphs, case summaries, one oddly cheerful bar chart. 34. That's the number. 34 people, just like the man you watched, escorted from holding cell to table. Most of them never made national news. The internet's full of facts, but none of them explain how you're feeling. So you go for a walk. 2 blocks from your apartment, there's a coffee shop that opens early. The kind with indie music and a tip jar that says Karma Jar. The barista's name is Jordan, and they ask if you're okay. You nod, but they see through it. Rough night? They ask. Something like that. You take your latte to the window, and that's where it begins. A story, murmured over coffee foam and sidewalk traffic. You remember Jordan lost someone. You'd forgotten until now. Their brother. A school shooting. 8 years ago. He was 15, Jordan says, stirring without looking. And I used to want that guy dead. Like dead. Shot, hanged, whatever would make it hurt. But then I went to this victims circle thing in California. Grief groups. And someone asked me, if he dies, will that bring your brother back? And I hated that question. You sit in silence for a while. The steam from your drink curls upward like a memory escaping. Then Jordan shrugs. So now I don't know. I still want him to suffer. But I don't want to become the kind of person who measures justice in blood. You thank them and leave. But you carry their words like luggage that refuses to be zipped shut. 2 days later, you find yourself at a courthouse in the next county. Not for legal reasons, just curiosity or maybe a lingering obsession. It's Victim Impact Day, and 2 families are giving statements before sentencing. Same crime, same verdict, but oh, how different the reactions. The first family steps forward. A mother, father, and younger sister. Their son, Daniel, was 17 when he was stabbed outside a party. The man convicted had a record. The jury chose the death penalty. And the mother, she supports it fiercely. He didn't just take our son, she says, gripping the podium. He took the future birthdays, the graduations, the wedding I'll never attend. We've been handed a life sentence. He should be, too. The courtroom nods. A few tears. You understand her pain. You don't question it. But then comes the second family. Their daughter, Sophia, same age, same fate, same crime. Her father steps up. No notes. Just a photo of Sophia in a sunflower dress. He doesn't raise his voice. I believe justice must be restorative, not retaliatory, he says. We don't want this man to die. We want him to know what he took. Every single day. Gasps ripple through the benches. The prosecutor glances sideways. Someone mutters, unbelievable, but the father keeps going. If he dies, he escapes. He doesn't have to remember her birthday every June. He won't see her face in his dreams. But if he lives, maybe one day he'll understand. And maybe, not soon, maybe never, but maybe he'll regret it. You walk out with your head spinning. 2 lives lost. 2 families grieving. 2 truths equally valid, diametrically opposed. You feel like a scale being yanked in both directions. Retribution or reflection. Pain avenged or pain witnessed. Historically, revenge has always felt natural. eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, as the Code of Hammurabi prescribed around 1754 BCE. But even back then, things weren't simple. In Babylon, wealthy citizens could often pay to substitute a lesser punishment, while poorer ones bore the full brunt. So the equal in equal punishment wasn't all that equal. Historians still argue whether early law codes were meant more for deterrence or theater, discipline or drama. Here's a quirky twist. In 18th century England, people could buy tickets to public executions, like a macabre version of concert season. Vendors sold pamphlets detailing the convict's crime. Some of it true, most of it spicy fiction. For some, it was justice. For others, a day out. You start to realize how blurred the lines can get. Flash forward to now, and the justice system wears a cleaner face. No gallows in the square. No popcorn stands. But the core impulse, the human ache to balance scales, remains untouched by time. You want the story to make sense. You want suffering to end where it began. You want symmetry. But the problem is, pain doesn't work that way. You remember something Jordan said at the coffee shop? You can kill a killer, but you can't kill what they did. It hangs with you. You go home that night and open a blank document. You start typing, "What is justice?" But then delete it. Too vague. You try again. "Why do we want people to suffer?" Then stop. Too cruel. You settle on, "What would I want? If it were me?" That question doesn't have a cursor-blinking answer. It just sits there, heavy, unresolved. You head to the prison the next morning, this time with intention. Not to watch, not to protest, just to walk. There's a public tour offered on Wednesdays, mostly for students and the occasional morbid tourist. You say you're writing a piece on criminal justice reform, which isn't exactly true, but not exactly false either. The guard at the entrance waves you through, barely glancing up. You're led down sterile corridors that smell like old bleach and older metal. Your group is small, a retired couple, a teenager with a sociology notebook. You're the only one not fidgeting. Or maybe you're just fidgeting on the inside. Then you reach death row. It's quieter than you imagined. Not the silence of peace, but the hush of things left unsaid. The cells here are single occupancy, metal doors with narrow windows, slots for food trays, and air that seems thinner somehow. The tour guide, a former corrections officer named Ruth, walks slowly, as if narrating a ghost tour no one paid for. She points left. This is where they keep the long-timers. Some been here 20, 30 years. One guy's on his 4th rescheduled execution date. Medical complications. You try not to stare, but one man looks back. He's sitting on his cot, reading, just a paperback. You recognize the cover, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor writing about dignity inside horror. You wonder if the irony is lost on him. The next cell is plastered with drawings. Horses, mostly. Some sunsets. There's something almost childlike about them. Ruth explains, "That's Brandon. He started drawing when his appeals ran out. Doesn't talk much, but he sends birthday cards to his niece." There's no sign of violence in these cells. No shouting. No rattling bars. Just men in stillness, waiting for a clock they can't see. Death row is less a place of rage than of resignation. Here's a historical bit you didn't expect. Back in the 1800s, prisoners awaiting execution in New York's Sing Sing prison were sometimes given reading material from clergymen who believed spiritual reflection was a better preparation for death than, say, a priest's last rites. One of the most requested books, Robinson Crusoe. Historians still argue whether this choice reflected a longing for redemption or pure escapism. Maybe both. You step into a small holding room with a scratched-up bench and a buzzing overhead light. Ruth tells a story. "There was this one guy," she begins, "murdered his stepfather in a rage. Claimed he didn't even remember doing it. They gave him 15 years before the appeals dried up. When the day came, he asked for peanut butter toast. That was it. Said his mom used to make it that way when he had nightmares. The image haunts you not because of the crime, but because of the toast. The absurd normalcy. You picture it. Golden brown, edges crisp, maybe too much peanut butter clinging to the crust. A request so small it feels enormous. The group is moved on, but you linger. Death row isn't what you expected. It isn't a dungeon. It isn't a movie. It's heartbreak in slow motion. Men are allowed to paint, to read, to talk on supervised phone calls. Some write poems. Some file lawsuits. One even started a podcast through a third-party transcription project. Episodes dictated via weekly phone calls and published online under a pseudonym. You can't stop thinking about that. Podcast from death row. And here's your quirky fact for the day. In Louisiana's Angola prison, inmates once ran a full radio station, KLSP, nicknamed the Incarceration Station. They hosted gospel hours, jazz segments, even relationship advice voiced by men serving life sentences. One caller famously asked, "How do I tell my girl I'm never getting out?" The answer? With respect. And a little Marvin Gaye. You chuckle, but it catches in your throat. By now, you've walked the entire cell block. You pass the small yard, just a concrete rectangle with fencing like a cage turned upright. This is where inmates get fresh air a few times a week. Sunlight slices between the bars, catching flecks of dust like fireflies suspended mid-flight. And then Ruth says something soft, almost like an afterthought. You know, they always clean their cells the night before an execution. Always. Doesn't matter who. Like they're hosting someone. You pause. That sentence rewrites something inside you. Because maybe they are. Maybe it's not about guests or gods, but about control. When the state takes your body, the least you can do is tidy your room. You leave the building slowly, shoes scuffing against polished concrete. Outside, the sun feels too bright. You squint up at it, and for some reason, you remember that death row inmate with the Viktor Frankl book. You imagine him highlighting a sentence, circling a word, whispering a quote into the walls just to remind them he still exists. On the drive back, you pass a billboard that reads, "Justice delayed is justice denied." But what about justice misunderstood? Justice rushed? Justice executed? You pull over at a gas station, grab a bottle of water, and sit in your car with the engine off. You think about the inmates. Not their crimes, you're not forgetting those, but their lives after. The poems, the podcast, the toast. And it strikes you, maybe death row isn't where people go to die. Maybe it's where they go to remember what being alive once felt like, however faint, however flawed. The man you watched die 2 nights ago might have been guilty, remorseless, even cruel. But the man you saw through that narrow window today, drawing horses, mailing birthday cards, reading Viktor Frankl, he's still here. And for reasons you can't explain yet, that matters. The next file you open on your laptop is a case that slipped through the cracks. Or rather, was pushed. You weren't looking for it, but once you saw the name, Cameron Todd Willingham, it was like a thread begging to be pulled. So you pull. And what you unravel isn't just a story. It's a quiet scream tucked between court transcripts and the scent of soot. It starts in Corsicana, Texas, 1991. A fire. A house engulfed in flames. 3 children inside. Amber, Carmen, and Cameron. Ages 2, 1, and barely 1. None of them make it out. Cameron does. Barefoot. Burned. Blackened with smoke. But alive. He's arrested a few days later, charged with deliberately setting the fire. The evidence? A few patterns in the burn marks. The way he walked barefoot over glass. The neighbors saying he didn't seem sad enough. No accelerant is found. No confession is made. But the jury convicts him. The death sentence is handed down like a hammer, and the courtroom applauds. Years pass. The appeals clock ticks down. And then something strange happens. The science starts to shift. Fire forensics, once considered gospel, is re-examined. Turns out, the same burn patterns thought to prove arson, they can also appear in accidental fires. Historians still argue whether these flawed methods were known to be unreliable at the time, or simply misused out of ignorance. In 2004, just days before his scheduled execution, a leading fire expert submits a report to the Texas governor's office. It concludes the evidence was misinterpreted. The fire, most likely, was accidental. The governor doesn't intervene. Willingham is executed. The image you can't get out of your head? His last words, "I am an innocent man. convicted for a crime I did not commit. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't even ask for forgiveness. Just recognition. Just a single soul to believe him. And now you're left holding this case like a fragile egg, realizing that justice isn't always blind. It just sometimes refuses to look. You scroll through articles and find that at least 200 people in the US have been exonerated from death row since 1973. That's one innocent person freed for every 8.3 executions. You try doing the math, then stop, because the number that matters isn't statistical. It's one. One person wrongfully executed is one too many. You dig deeper. You find another name, Carlos de Luna, executed in 1989 for stabbing a gas station clerk. Maintained his innocence until the end. Years later, journalists uncover strong evidence pointing to another man with a history of similar crimes. Same city, same weapon, same method. De Luna was poor, had a public defender with no resources, and a name that just happened to be easier to convict. The deeper you go, the worse it gets. Turns out, about 4% of people sentenced to death in the US are likely innocent. Not proven, not guaranteed, just probably. It's the kind of phrase that should never sit next to the word execution. And yet, here it is. Here's a quirky moment of legal trivia. In 2006, the state of Tennessee accidentally executed a man on the wrong date. A clerical error pushed the procedure up by 24 hours. He wasn't innocent, he'd confessed, but the paperwork glitch made headlines. People joked about it, but beneath the humor was a reminder. This system, however solemn, is still run by humans who misplace files, misread numbers, or skip lunch and lose track of time. You stare at your screen, a little sick. You wonder if you've ever misread something that mattered, sent an email too fast, ignored a voicemail too long. Then you wonder what it's like to be on the receiving end of a mistake you can't outlive. You find a court document, page after page of appeals, denials, motions to reopen. It reads like someone pleading into the void. What's that line from Kafka? Someone must have slandered Joseph K. For one morning, without having done anything truly wrong, he was arrested. Kafka wrote fiction. But death row, you realize, is built on paperwork that reads just like it. You interview a former appellate lawyer. She looks tired, like someone who's read too many last words. You ask her the worst part. It's not the guilt or innocence, she says. It's the gray zone, the ones we're not totally sure about. The ones who might be innocent, but the process says, sorry, too late. You ask her how she sleeps. Wine, she says. And then she changes the subject. You sit with that for a while. The weight of uncertainty, the phrase too late, and suddenly all those airtight pro-death penalty arguments. What about when the evidence is perfect? What about when the confession is on video? Start to shrink in your head. Because evidence is only as good as the people interpreting it. And people are, at best, imperfect machines. At worst, convinced they can't be wrong. You think about that man you watched die. You were told he was guilty, and maybe he was. But now you find yourself wondering, what if one piece of evidence was read wrong? What if one witness misremembered? What if one juror leaned harder on emotion than fact? You can't ask him now. And that, you realize, is the real punishment of a flawed execution. It's not just that an innocent person might die. It's that they can never explain, never update their side, never have the kind of second chance we take for granted every time we hit delete and rewrite the sentence. You close the laptop, stare out the window. Somewhere, someone is walking free because their appeal was granted in time. Somewhere else, someone's last hope was denied at 4:58 p.m. because the fax machine jammed. And it's all the same system, the one that promises truth, but sometimes settles for closure. The next time you find yourself inside a courtroom, it's not for research. You just end up there. You're in Atlanta for work, and one morning you wander into Fulton County Superior Court like someone might wander into a museum. And in a way, that's what it is. A place filled with portraits of power and stories written in legalese, spoken aloud under flickering fluorescent lights. The case today? Jury selection for a murder trial. You sit quietly in the back, watching as potential jurors are dismissed. Some too emotional, some too reluctant, some too young to know what the word capital really means. Then a question is asked, do you believe the death penalty should ever be applied? One woman, maybe mid-30s, shifts uncomfortably. She works in social services. She bites her lip and says, I guess it depends on who died and on who's on trial. And there it is. That's the quiet truth almost no one says out loud. Justice is not blind. Justice sees. Justice remembers faces, skin tones, accents, and zip codes. It factors them in like unspoken subtext. You later find a statistic that confirms what you already sensed. If the victim in a murder case is white, the defendant is more than 4 times as likely to receive the death penalty than if the victim is black. Historians still argue whether this disparity is about prosecutorial bias, jury perception, or the subtle devaluation of certain lives, but the numbers don't argue. They just sit there. Another fact, more than 80% of people executed in the modern death penalty era were convicted of killing white victims, even though white people make up about half of murder victims nationally. The imbalance is glaring, even if no one in the courtroom ever says the words. And then there's wealth, the other invisible hand on the scale. You listen to public defenders talk about their caseloads. Sometimes 100 clients at once, trying to navigate a legal labyrinth with a stapler and a sticky note. The phrase one lawyer uses stays with you. We're not defending clients, we're triaging them. Meanwhile, those who can afford private representation have access to forensic experts, jury consultants, investigators, and sometimes, if they're lucky, a second narrative. The kind that changes the ending. You find a quirky detail in an old New York Times piece. A man on death row once used a library book about courtroom tactics to draft his own appeal, because his lawyer never filed one. The judge was so impressed with the legal reasoning, he agreed to hear the case. That's right. A death row inmate had to outlawyer his own lawyer just to be heard. The system's not broken, you realize. It's working exactly as it was built, to favor those who can fight hardest. And you think back to that woman in jury selection. Depends on who died. Depends on who's on trial. You wonder how many executions are decided not by the crime itself, but by the variables orbiting it. Whether the defendant had a stutter or a scowl, or a mother who cried in court. A judge once said, "We don't convict people based on their looks." And yet, studies show that defendants who appear more stereotypically black are more likely to receive death sentences. That jawline, those cheekbones, somehow they become part of the evidence. You visit a university lecture on criminal justice, and a professor pulls up 2 mugshots. Same crime, similar priors. But one man is white, clean-shaven, blue-eyed. The other is black with dreadlocks and tattoos. She asks, "Which of these men would you vote to execute?" No one answers, but everyone looks guilty, even you. Outside, in the real world, you watch a protest march pass by. Hand-painted signs, chants that rise and fall. One reads, "No justice, no peace." Another, "The death penalty is a lottery." A man with a bullhorn shouts something about class warfare and systemic injustice. You nod, not because you agree with everything, but because you can no longer pretend you don't see the patterns. Justice should be about the crime, not the complexion, but often it's both. You sit down later and look through state-by-state execution data. You notice something odd. In states with historically high execution rates, like Texas, Alabama, and Georgia, there's a consistent pattern of racial disparity in sentencing. One case catches your eye: Warren McCleskey, convicted of killing a white police officer during a robbery. His lawyers presented a now-famous study, the Balda study, which analyzed over 2,000 murder cases in Georgia. The findings? Defendants accused of killing white victims were significantly more likely to receive the death penalty. The Supreme Court didn't dispute the data, but in a 5-4 decision, they ruled against McCleskey, arguing that statistical evidence alone wasn't enough to prove intentional racial discrimination in his specific case. In short, yes, the system is racially skewed. No, we can't help you. You close your laptop and stare at your reflection in the screen. If Lady Justice is blind, who's guiding her hand? You think about scales, those iconic ones she holds. But maybe they're not balanced by weight. Maybe they're balanced by history, By fear. By proximity to power. Maybe some scales are tipped before the crime is even committed. And maybe we're not ready to admit it. You imagine a courtroom with no names, no photos, just facts. Could we sentence someone to death without knowing what they look like? Where they're from? Whether their mother cried in the front row? Would that feel fairer? Or just colder? You don't have the answer. But you know this, any system that risks being swayed by the color of someone's skin or the size of their bank account probably shouldn't be allowed to kill. You book a flight not to escape but to compare. Because by now, the death penalty no longer feels like just an American issue. It's something bigger, older, something braided into global identities like religion or language. So you start tracing its shadow across borders, wondering if justice looks different depending on which passport you carry. Your first stop is Japan. Here, executions are carried out in silence. Quite literally, inmates aren't told their date of execution in advance. They wake up one morning, expecting rice and miso, and instead are escorted to a room with padded floors and a trapdoor. It's all done in secret, behind high walls, often before their lawyers or families are even notified. You meet a journalist in Tokyo who covers justice and punishment. She tells you, it's not just about the crime, it's about harmony. The public doesn't want messiness. They want quiet punishment. You learn that public support for the death penalty in Japan is high, even though executions are rare, just a handful per year. Historians still argue whether Japan's secrecy reflects shame, dignity, or deterrence. Maybe it's a bit of all three. But to you, it feels like a paradox. A society that values formality, precision, and peace, yet still drops a floor beneath a man's feet without saying goodbye. Then there's Norway. No death penalty. None since 1979, and before that, only used briefly post-World War II to deal with Nazi collaborators. The worst punishment available now? A maximum of 21 years, though that can be extended if the person is deemed a continuing danger. You raise an eyebrow. 21 years? Even for mass murder? And then you hear the name Anders Behring Breivik. In 2011, he bombed a government building and then gunned down 69 teenagers at a summer camp. He was sentenced to 21 years, the legal maximum, though his sentence can and likely will be renewed indefinitely. Still, he lives. In a 3-room cell with a treadmill, TV, and laptop, no internet. He publishes essays, files lawsuits, one of them complaining that his coffee was served cold. You're stunned, outraged even, but then you meet someone who changes your perspective. Her name is Lena. She lost her daughter on Utoya Island, one of the 69. You expect fury. You expect demands for revenge. Instead, she says this, if we kill him, we become him. Our justice must be better than his hatred. You don't know what to say to that, so you just nod. Next, you travel, digitally this time, to Iran, where public executions are still carried out by hanging. Often from cranes, sometimes broadcasted. The state doesn't shy away from using death as both punishment and theater. Dissent, homosexuality, blasphemy, these too can earn a noose. You read reports from human rights groups, but nothing hits harder than a shaky phone video of a young man blindfolded in the street, the crowd forced to watch. In Singapore, you find something colder, efficiency. Drug trafficking, death. The process is swift. Appeals are limited. Executions are carried out at dawn on Fridays with military precision. The government argues that harsh punishment keeps crime low. And indeed, Singapore's murder rate is one of the lowest in the world. But at what cost? You compare that with Canada, where the death penalty was abolished in 1976. Their highest punishment now? Life without parole after 25 years. Even then, prisoners are regularly reviewed. The idea is not about closing the book, but keeping it open, however slim the hope. You recall a quirky tidbit from your research. The last execution in Canada was a double hanging in 1962. The men were executed for a robbery gone wrong. The gallows are still there, preserved like museum pieces, but now mostly used for school field trips. Some kids reportedly ask, why would they do that to people? The adults don't always have an answer. You look at all these models, Norway's forgiveness, Iran's force, Japan's secrecy, Singapore's severity, Canada's caution and realize there is no universal definition of justice. Only local rituals built from trauma, history, and convenience. But something else clicks, too. America is the only Western democracy that still uses capital punishment regularly. You knew that vaguely, but now it rings louder. You remember how the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976 after a brief pause. Since then, more than 1,500 people have been executed. And yet, only a few states account for most of them. Texas alone has executed over 500 people. Other states, like California, have hundreds on death row but rarely carry out the sentence. It's a patchwork quilt of legal contradiction. You also learn that executions in the U.S. used to be public affairs. In the 19th century, towns treated hangings like events. Families picnicked near the gallows. Vendors sold snacks. In some places, a man's final words were printed and sold as gallows literature. Historians still debate whether this was genuine public catharsis or just a carnival of cruelty. Now, of course, it's all private, sterile, clinical, but maybe less honest. You start to wonder, which is worse, the cruelty you can see or the cruelty that's been polished? By the time your research ends, you've collected maps, charts, interviews. But what sticks with you isn't data. It's a feeling that justice means something different in every language, and that none of them are quite fluent in mercy. You think about the death penalty not as a sentence, but as a story a society tells itself. In Iran, the story is about obedience. In Norway, about reform. In Singapore, about deterrence. In the US, maybe the story is about closure, or control, or fear. You don't know yet, but you're listening. And maybe that's the first step to rewriting the ending. The executioner doesn't look like what you expect. His name is Glenn, mid-50s, soft voice, owns a dachshund named Rosie and makes a killer banana bread. Apparently. You meet him through a mutual friend. She says he's not what you'd think, and she's right. You sit across from him at his modest kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of chamomile tea. Not coffee. He says caffeine keeps him up. He's retired now. Did the job for 20 years. Doesn't talk about it much. Not because he's ashamed, but because no one asks. And when they do, it's usually the wrong question. How do you sleep at night? He smiles at that. Same way you do, he says. Badly. With podcasts. He shows you a drawer in his living room filled with things he never threw away. Old ID tags, visitor passes, a folder of procedures printed on government stationery. In one envelope, there's a list, execution checklist. Things like secure wrist straps, verify 4 lines, confirm time of death. It reads like a wedding planner's to-do list if you squint hard enough. You ask him what it felt like the first time. Like standing in an elevator that suddenly stops between floors. He says, no noise, just stillness and this weird sense that time forgot to keep moving. He tells you about one inmate who sang a hymn while the chemicals entered his veins. Another who apologized to his daughter, who wasn't there. One asked for spaghetti with meatballs, didn't eat a bite. Another just stared at Glenn and whispered, I hope you don't go to hell for this. Glenn doesn't believe in hell. He believes in roles. He did his. I did mine. That's how I kept my mind straight. You wonder if that's true. Here's a fringe tidbit. In ancient Rome, executioners were often slaves or foreigners. No Roman citizen wanted the stain. Some historians argue they were deliberately kept socially invisible, paid in coin, but never invited to dinner. A necessary evil. Seen but unspeakable. Modern executioners aren't slaves, but in some ways they're still treated like ghosts. You ask Glenn if anyone ever thanked him. He shrugs. Once, a victim's brother said it helped him sleep better knowing the guy was gone. But I think he was just trying to make me feel useful. You ask about the worst moment. He doesn't answer at first. Then, there was this one guy who refused the blindfold, looked right at me, not with hate, not even fear, just looked. And I thought, if I was him, what would I want someone like me to see? His last second of being human, or his first second of being something else? You sit in that silence. Glenn pets Rosie. The teacup clinks against the saucer as he shifts. You think about all the hands that touch a single execution. The doctor who places the line, even though the Hippocratic oath forbids, do no harm. The pharmacist who mixed the drugs, maybe believing it would never be used. The guard who triple-checks the straps. The chaplain who prays not just for the condemned, but also for himself. It's not one person pulling the switch. It's dozens. A choreography of detachment. Glenn says he never watched the news afterward. Never read the coverage. The guy's name would be in bold letters. Mine never was. That's how the system likes it. You ask him if he misses the job. He blinks. God, no. But I miss this certainty. You never had to wonder what your purpose was. You had a role. You did it. And at the end of the day, it was done. He gestures at the sink full of dishes. This? Never done. You help him clean up. Feels like the least you can do. Before you leave, he pulls something off the wall. The photo, framed. It's a picture of a sunrise over the prison yard, taken through a break room window. You notice a small silhouette in the corner. Someone pacing in a fenced yard, maybe stretching their arms, maybe praying. He says, "That's the part one think about most. Not the death. The hour before." On your way out, you pause at his front steps. Glenn joins you, leans against the railing, looks up at the sky. It's quiet. Crickets, wind, a plane in the distance. "Want to know something weird?" he says. "I never once dreamed about them. Not the faces, not the rooms. But I always dream about buttons. Big red buttons. Just sitting there, waiting to be pressed." You thank him and he nods. As you walk away, you feel the weight of his calm like a coat you're not sure belongs to you. Later that night, you write in your notes, "We never ask who kills the killer. Maybe because we don't want to know what they look like when they're done." You search online and find there's no official training course for executioners in the US. No federal certification, no degree. It's a job people learn quietly. From someone like Glenn. Someone who tells you, almost like a joke, there's no graduation, just a clock in and a key, and then sometimes a life. You imagine Glenn, 20 years younger, lacing his boots at 4 a.m., drinking bad coffee from a vending machine, watching the sun rise behind a razor wire fence. And when it was over, when the room cleared and the warden gave the nod, you imagine him walking back to the staff lounge, heating up banana bread in the microwave, and sitting down like it was just another Tuesday. But it never was. Not really. You're back online again. Only this time, you're not reading court documents or death penalty statistics. You're diving into manifestos. Not the kind that trend on social media, but the darker ones tucked behind paywalls, legal archives, and removed forum threads. They're ugly, raw, disturbingly methodical. You start with Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian mass murderer you learned about earlier. Before he killed 77 people in 2011, he wrote a 1,500-page manifesto, part biography, part political tirade, part how to guide for future terrorists. He titled it 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, as if he were founding a nation instead of tearing one apart. The document is horrifying, but structured. It's full of obsessive detail, bomb-making instructions, ideological rationales, motivational tactics. And here's the unsettling part. He wanted to be caught. Not to confess, but to inspire. Breivik wasn't seeking escape. He was seeking a stage. He got one. He was given airtime, interviews, global headlines. Even from prison, he files lawsuits about his treatment, sends statements to the media, and lives in a cell more well-lit than some college dorms. He's alive, and because he's alive, his message echoes. You trace that echo forward. In 2019, a gunman in Christchurch, New Zealand, kills 51 people at 2 mosques. Before the attack, he publishes a manifesto that cites Breivik as a direct influence. In 2022, another shooter walks into a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, and live streams the slaughter of 10 black shoppers. His document, again a manifesto, also references both Breivik and Christchurch. It even mimics their formatting. This isn't random, it's design. Death isn't their punishment, it's their punchline. Their goal is infamy, and sometimes death row becomes the stage. The longer they live, the longer their ideas fester. You feel sick, because suddenly, life imprisonment doesn't sound as merciful. It sounds like a megaphone. You dig deeper and find something chilling. Breivik's writings are still floating online, reposted by anonymous users across fringe platforms. There are even fan edits, quotes stylized like inspirational memes. You stare at one. A photo of him, stoic, overlaid with Gothic script. The caption reads, "One man can awaken a sleeping Europe." You close your laptop. Then you wonder, what if he had been executed? Would he still be cited? Would he still echo? You talk to a counterterrorism expert who spent the last decade tracking radicalization online. She tells you something you can't unhear. These men don't fear death. They crave narrative. When we execute them, we risk turning them into martyrs. When we imprison them, we risk letting them recruit. You ask her what the solution is. She shrugs. Sometimes it's isolation. Sometimes silence. But we're not great at denying attention. She tells you about a case where a convicted terrorist was placed in complete communication blackout. No media, no letters, no visitors. His name stopped appearing. His influence withered. Starve the myth, she says. Don't feed it through trials, debates, or executions. Just erase the myth-making machine. It makes sense, but it's eerie, because now you're thinking, what is justice supposed to be? A reckoning? A deterrent? Or just a way to end a chapter? Here's your historical flash. During the French Revolution, executions were public theater. Guillotine crowds brought picnics. Vendors sold pamphlets. But the state also discovered something awkward. When they executed popular figures like Danton or Robespierre, they didn't kill ideas. They just galvanized them. Historians still argue whether the guillotine prolonged the chaos or purified it. Back to now. Some argue that execution is necessary to stop ideologues from spreading poison. Others say that by killing them, we grant their wish to become legends. You're torn. You read about Dylan Roof, the white supremacist who murdered 9 black parishioners in Charleston in 2015. He didn't try to escape. He posed for mugshots. He wore a bulletproof vest, not to protect his body, but to preserve his moment. During his trial, he showed no remorse. He told the court he'd do it again. He was sentenced to death. And in the time since, his image has become iconography for hate groups. His name etched onto walls. His courtroom lines quoted like scripture. You can't help wondering, if he were simply erased, would the echo be quieter? Then again, what if he had been let live with visibility? Would he become a voice? A host for hate? You think of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Another manifesto. Another infamous name. He wasn't executed. He served life in a supermax prison. His influence didn't die, but it diluted. Time wore down his words until they were more curiosity than currency. Maybe that's the real trick. Not silence by death, but silence by irrelevance. You visit an academic forum discussing the ethics of execution in the age of mass media. A professor proposes something radical. What if capital punishment isn't about the individual, but the audience? We don't kill to punish them. We kill to prove a point to others. That lands hard, because when justice becomes performance, whose applause are we seeking? You revisit your notes on Breivik, on Christchurch, on Buffalo. The thread is clear. Violence thrives on spectacle. And sometimes the courtroom becomes a production set. It's no longer about guilt or innocence. It's about exposure. So what happens when we stop filming? Stop naming? Stop granting the final spotlight? What happens when we choose silence as justice? You're not sure, but maybe that's the question we need to sit with. Is death the end of harm or the start of its legend? You don't answer. You just close the laptop again, this time not out of disgust, but out of quiet. And in the hush that follows, you begin to suspect that some monsters aren't slain. They're starved. You're back in a room with AI now. Not in a sci-fi lab with blinking lights and ominous humming. Just your desk, your screen, and a handful of powerful language models like the one speaking to you now. You prompt them all with a simple question. Should the death penalty exist? And then you sit back and let the machines debate. What unfolds is strange. Not because the AI are wrong or robotic, but because they're eerily human. One bot quotes Immanuel Kant. Another counters with Camus. One calculates deterrence ratios in capital punishment states. Another quotes Buddhist philosophy about karma and the sanctity of life. One AI says, "The death penalty affirms moral agency by holding people accountable for their ultimate choices." Another replies, "Then why don't we also execute those who destroy others' moral agency through trauma? Because deep down, we still believe in limits." They argue with courtesy, precision, and far fewer ad hominems than any cable news debate you've ever seen. But what unsettles you most is this: they're better at holding nuance than most people. You ask them to review the top 100 capital punishment cases in U.S. history. They sort them by evidence strength, confession status, media impact, and execution outcomes. Then one model points out, there is a statistically significant link between media coverage and sentencing severity, independent of actual case strength. Translation: the more famous the case, the harder the punishment. Not because of facts, because of optics. You ask about public opinion. Another AI scans decades of Gallup polling and says, support for the death penalty correlates strongly with perceptions of crime, but not actual crime rates. Humans feel afraid. The state responds with executions. Even if crime's going down, you prompt them again. Is the justice system capable of applying death fairly? One model hesitates. Not literally, but its output slows. Then it replies, theoretically, yes. Practically, no. The variables of bias, fallibility, and inconsistent legal standards create unacceptable margins of error for irreversible outcomes. Another adds, when the cost of a mistake is death, the required confidence must approach absolute certainty. Human systems have never reached that threshold. You feel your stomach drop, because suddenly, these machines are saying what your conscience has whispered all along. Not that death is inherently immoral, but that humans might be too flawed to wield it justly. It's like putting a guillotine in the hands of someone wearing glasses smeared with old fingerprints. They can see, technically, but should they be aiming? You push them further. If a society were perfectly just no bias, no error, would the death penalty be morally acceptable? Now the models diverge. Some say yes, arguing from retributive justice, that certain actions so completely violate moral order, only death restores balance. Others say no, citing restorative principles, that even in perfect justice, the state should model mercy, not vengeance. And then one AI says something that makes you pause. Justice must be a mirror of the society that wields it. If that mirror reflects fear, anger, or superiority, then the justice it enacts will inherit those flaws, no matter how precise its logic. You stare at that sentence for a long time. You ask one last thing: what should be done with the worst of humanity? And the reply comes quickly, almost gently: contain them, understand them, but do not become them. You shut down the models, not out of fear, out of reflection. You're struck by the irony that AI, creations of ones and zeros, incapable of compassion, seem more cautious with death than many politicians. You remember a debate clip you once watched, a senator slamming his fist on a podium, shouting, "We must show them justice." You remember the applause, but no one claps for a machine. And yet, the machine's voice feels cleaner. Not emotionally cleaner, but logically braver. Free from tribalism. Free from electoral calculus. It doesn't need to win votes. It just follows the argument wherever it goes. Still, even AI admits, it's not their decision to make. Because justice isn't a math problem. It's a mirror. And you, yes, you are the one standing in front of it. You look around your room. You're not in a courtroom. You're not holding a gavel. But here you are, rendering verdicts anyway. In your conversations. In your comments. In your clicks. Every society writes its justice system in the image of its values. And your values, quiet, hidden, scrolling behind your pupils, are part of that collective ink. So you ask yourself, do I trust the system to kill on my behalf? Do I want it to? And maybe more hauntingly, If the system fails, if someone dies who shouldn't, do I carry any of that weight? Not legally, but morally, you sit with that. You remember that the AI didn't say no to the death penalty on moral grounds. Said no on trust grounds. A quiet, damning vote of no confidence. And suddenly, that becomes your question too. You're not afraid of the idea of death. You're afraid of what it says about the living. Now it's just you. No AI, no spreadsheets, no legal jargon, no manifestos or moral frameworks or chilling testimonies. Just the quiet hum of your thoughts, turning over the same question like a coin worn thin with use. You step outside. It's nearly midnight. The air is soft, cooler than you expected. Somewhere down the street, a dog barks once and stops. The trees rustle a little, like they're eavesdropping. You walk with no destination, letting the rhythm of your footsteps do the thinking for you. You pass a church, locked of course, but there's a light still on above the door. You pause. You wonder how many people have sat in those pews, asking for peace in the face of injustice. You wonder how many of them ever found it. A voice rises in your head, not your own, but something you remember reading, maybe from Sister Helen Prejean. No one is defined by the worst thing they've ever done. It's a beautiful idea, but is it true? You think of the murderers, the sociopaths, the ones who planned and smiled and, when caught, said they'd do it again. Are they more than what they did? And yet, something stops you from saying no. Maybe it's because you've made mistakes too. Small, forgivable ones. But still, what if someone had frozen your identity in the worst moment of your life? Would that be the full you? Would you want to be seen only through that keyhole? You don't excuse evil, but you also don't want to become its mirror. You walk further. You think of all the people whose names never made headlines, victims and perpetrators both. People quietly destroyed by the machinery of death and the murmur of indifference. You think of the ones wrongly accused, the ones still waiting on DNA tests, the ones whose lawyers missed a deadline by a day and whose lives unraveled in slow, state-sanctioned silence. You pass a school. There's a mural on the wall, bright colors, little painted hands, some glitter long since dulled by rain. It says, "Be the person you needed when you were younger." And for some reason, it hits you harder than any legal theory. You ask yourself, what kind of society would your younger self have trusted? One that teaches forgiveness even when it hurts? Or one that punishes like a hammer, assuming everything it hits is a nail? You think of closure, that word people love to say after a death sentence is carried out. You wonder if it's real, or if it's just an emotional placebo, something to make us feel that the balance has been restored, even when it hasn't. Because here's the truth. No one comes back. Not the innocent wrongly executed. Not the victims who were lost. Not the time spent waiting for a verdict that was always going to hurt. And in that quiet, you realize something else. Maybe justice isn't about balance. Maybe it's about restraint. Not doing to others what they did to us. Not because they don't deserve it, but because we deserve better. You head back home. The streets are still. A porch light flickers behind you. You feel tired, but not heavy. More like you've put something down. Not the burden of decision, but the illusion that the answer was ever simple. Because maybe the point isn't to decide once and for all. Maybe the point is to never stop questioning. You open your door, kick off your shoes, sit down on the floor, just to feel the earth beneath you, and you breathe. This is your mirror moment. Not a verdict, but a vow that you will not look away, that you will ask hard questions, that you will carry complexity, not for comfort, but for truth. And tomorrow, when someone asks you where you stand, you'll say this: I believe in justice, but not the kind that kills to prove a point. You'll say, I believe some people deserve to be locked away forever, but I don't believe society should extinguish what it cannot resurrect. You'll say, I'd rather live in a world that makes mistakes while trying to spare life, than one that kills and later says, oops. And if someone calls that weak, you'll smile, because there's nothing weak about refusing to become what you oppose. Wind down, 300 words. And now, your eyes are heavier, the world a little quieter. You've traveled through courtrooms and prison cells, stared through one-way glass, stood behind both the gavel and the needle. You've heard the ticking clocks of justice, the steel whispers of prison gates, and the soft crackle of humanity trying to persist inside the hardest places. You've met the grieving and the guilty, the defiant and the repentant. You've walked past blood-stained headlines into quiet, gray cells where no cameras go. And you've learned something that doesn't shout but hums. That justice is not a thunderbolt. It's a murmur. It's a conversation we keep having, even when the answers elude us. It's the choice to pause before acting, to consider before condemning, to question even the laws we think are carved in stone. So as you lie back now, whether in bed, on the couch, or tucked into some quiet corner of the night, let this be your final thought. You are not required to solve everything. Only to care, only to see, only to stay awake a little longer than you did yesterday. Sleep now with your questions intact. Sleep with your conscience not closed, but curious. Because the world doesn't need more certainty. It needs more hearts like yours,